Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Although I'm reading the next part of the wonderful story of Henry Sugar, I just hit a highlight. This is my 100th episode of Storytime with Eric Zimmer. I can't believe I've made it this far. Anyways, where we last left off in the wonderful story of Henry Sugar, Henry had finished reading the story about John F. Cartwright's report about Imrat Khan, the Indian man who sees without his eyes, and he decided, Henry Sugar, to develop yogi powers as well. And he is now able to see through cards, playing cards, in 4 seconds flat, which means he could make a fortune. By knowing every card, he would win every time he played any card game in a casino. And now he's about to test it out. So you ready? Sure? Alright. Let's begin. Chapter 9. Lord's house was a magnificent Georgian mansion in the center of London, and for over 200 years it had been the private residence of a duke. I'm sure it must have been multiple dukes if it had been owned by them for 200 years or more than that. Now it was taken over by the bookmakers, and the superb highlighted ceiling rooms where the aristocracy and often royalty used to gather and play a gentle game of whist were today filled with a new kind of people who played a very different sort of game. Henry drove to Lord's house and pulled up outside the great entrance. He got out of the car, but left the engine running. Immediately, an attendant in a green uniform came forward to park it for him. Along the curb on both sides of the street stood perhaps a dozen Rolls Royces. Only the very wealthy belonged to Lord's house. "Why, hello, Mr. Henry Sugar," said the man behind the desk whose job it was never to forget a face. "We haven't seen you for over 3 years." "I've been busy," Henry answered. He went upstairs, up the marvelous wide staircase with its carved mahogany banisters, and entered the cashier's office. There he wrote a check for £1,000. The cashier gave him 10 large pink rectangular plaques made of plastic. On each it said £100. Henry slipped them into his pocket and spent a few minutes sauntering through the various gaming rooms to get the feel of things again after such a long absence. There was a big crowd here tonight. Well-fed women stood around the roulette wheel like plump hens around a feeding hopper. Jewels and gold were dripping over their bosoms and from their wrists. Many of them had blue hair. The men were in dinner jackets, and there wasn't a tall one among them. Well, Henry was said to be 6'2", so he must be among the tall ones, although there aren't too many of them. Why, Henry wondered, did this particular kind of rich man always have short legs? Their legs all seemed to stop at the knees, with no thighs above. Most of them had bellies coming out a long way, and crimson faces and cigars between their lips. Their eyes glittered with greed. All this Henry noticed. It was the first time in his life that he had looked with distaste upon this type of wealthy gambling casino person. Up until now, he had always remembered them as companions, as members of the same group and class as himself. Tonight, they seemed vulgar. Could it be, he wondered, that the yoga powers he had acquired over the last 3 years and 3 months had altered him just a little bit? I think it's very possible. He stood watching the roulette. Upon the long green table, people were placing their money, trying to guess which little slot the small white ball would fall into on the next spin of the wheel. Henry looked at the wheel. Suddenly, perhaps more from habit than anything else, he found himself beginning to concentrate upon it. It was not difficult. He had been practicing the art of total concentration for so long that it had become something of a routine. In a fraction of a second, his mind had become completely and absolutely concentrated upon the wheel. Everything else in the room, the noise, the people, the lights, the smell of cigar smoke, all this was wiped out of his mind, and he saw only the round, polished roulette wheel with the small white numbers around the rim. The numbers went from 1 to 36, with a 0, a double 0 to be exact, between 1 and 36. Very quickly, all the numbers blurred and disappeared in front of his eyes. All except one. All except the number 18. The 18 was the only number he could see. At first it was slightly fuzzy and out of focus. Then the edges sharpened and the whiteness of it grew brighter, more brilliant, until it began to glow as though there was a bright light behind it. It grew bigger. It seemed to jump towards him. At that point, Henry switched off his concentration. The room swam back into vision. "Have you all finished?" the croupier was saying. Henry took a 100-pound plaque from his pocket and placed it on the square marked 18 on the green table. Although the table was covered all over with other people's bets, his was the only one on 18. The croupier spun the wheel. The little white ball bounced and skittered around the rim. The people watched. All eyes were on the little ball. The wheel slowed. It came to rest. The ball jiggled a few more times, hesitated, then dropped neatly into slot 18. 18! Called the croupier. The crowd sighed. The croupier's assistant scooped up the piles of losing plaques with a long-handled wooden scooper. But he didn't take Henry's. They paid him 36 to 1. 3,600 pounds for his 100 pounds. They gave it to him in three 1,000-pound plaques and 6 100-pound plaques. Henry began to feel an extraordinary sense of power. He felt he could break this place if he wanted to. He could ruin this fancy, high-powered, expensive joint in a matter of hours. He could make 1,000,000 of them, and all the stony-faced, sleek gentlemen who stood around watching the money rolling in would be scurrying about like panicky rats. Should he do that? It was a great temptation. But it would be the end of everything. He would become famous and would never be allowed into a casino again anywhere in the world. He mustn't do it. He must be very careful not to draw attention to himself. Henry moved casually out of the roulette room and passed into the room where they were playing blackjack. He stood in the doorway watching the action. There were 4 tables. They were oddly shaped, these blackjack tables, each one curved like a crescent moon, with the players sitting on high stools around the outside of the half circle and the dealer standing inside. The packs of cards, at Lord's house they used 4 packs shuffled together, 208 cards, lay in an open-ended box known as a shoe, and the dealer pulled the cards out of the shoe one by one with his fingers. The reverse side of the first card in the shoe was always visible, but no others. Blackjack, as the casinos call it, is a very simple game. You and I know it by one of 3 other names: Pontoon, 21, or Vinect-un. The player tries to get his cards to add up to as near 21 as possible, but if he goes over 21, he's busted and the dealer takes the money. In nearly every hand, the player is faced with the problem of whether to draw another card and risk being bust, or whether to stick with what he's got. But Henry would not have that problem. In 4 seconds, he would have seen through the card the dealer was offering him, and he would know whether to say yes or no. Henry could turn blackjack into a farce. In all casinos, they have an awkward rule about blackjack betting that we do not have at home. At home, we look at our first card before we make a bet. And if it's a good one, we bet high. The casinos don't allow you to do this. They insist that everyone at the table makes his bet before the first card of the hand is dealt. What's more, you are not allowed to increase your bet later on by buying a card. None of this would disturb Henry either. So long as he sat on the dealer's immediate left, then he would always receive the first card in the shoe at the beginning of each deal. The reverse side of this card would be clearly visible to him, and he would read through it before he made his bet. Now standing quietly just inside the doorway, Henry waited for a place to become vacant on the dealer's left at any of the 4 tables. He had to wait 20 minutes for this to happen, but he got what he wanted in the end. He perched himself on the high stool and handed the dealer one of the 1,000-pound plaques he had won at roulette. "All in 25s, please," he said. The dealer was a youngish man with black eyes and gray skin. He never smiled, and he spoke only when necessary. His hands were exceptionally slim, and there was arithmetic in his fingers. He took Henry's plaque and dropped it into a slot in the table. Rows of different-colored, circular chips lay neatly on a wooden tray in front of him. Chips for 25 pounds, 10 pounds, and 5 pounds. Maybe 100 of each. With his thumb and forefinger, the dealer picked up a wedge of 25-pound chips and placed them in a tall pile on the table. He didn't have to count them. He knew there were exactly 20 chips in the pile. Those nimble fingers could pick up with absolute accuracy any number of chips from 1 to 20 and never be wrong. The dealer picked up a second lot of 20 chips, making 40 in all. He slid them over the table to Henry. Henry stacked the chips in front of him, and as he did so, he glanced at the top card in the shoe. He switched on his concentration, and in 4 seconds he read it as a 10. He pushed out 8 of his chips, 200 pounds. This was the maximum stake allowed for blackjack at Lord's house. He was dealt the 10, and for his second card he got a 9. 19 altogether. Everyone sticks on 19. You sit tight and hope the dealer won't get 20 or 21. So when the dealer came out again to Henry, he said, 19, and passed on to the next player. "Wait," Henry said. The dealer paused and came back to Henry. He raised his brows and looked at him with those cool black eyes. "You wish to draw to 19? He asked somewhat sarcastically. "You wish to draw to 19? He asked somewhat sarcastically. He spoke with an Italian accent, and there was scorn as well as sarcasm in his voice. There were only 2 cards in the pack that would not bust at 19. The ace, counting as a 1, and the 2. Only an idiot would risk drawing to 19, especially with 200 pounds on the table. The next card to be dealt lay clearly visible in the front of the shoe. At least the reverse side of it was clearly visible. The dealer hadn't yet touched it. "Yes," Henry said. "I think I'll have another card." The dealer shrugged and flipped the card out of the shoe. The 2 of clubs landed neatly in front of Henry alongside the 10 and the 9. "Thank you," Henry said. "That will do nicely." 21, the dealer said. His black eyes glanced up again into Henry's face, and they rested there, silent, watchful, puzzled. Henry had unbalanced him. He had never in his life seen anyone draw to a 19. This fellow had drawn to 19 with a calmness and a certainty that was quite staggering, and he had won. Henry caught the look in the dealer's eyes, and he realized at once that he had made a silly mistake. He had been too clever. He had drawn attention to himself. He must never do that again. He must be very careful. He must be very careful in the future how he used his powers. He must even make himself lose occasionally. And every now and again, he must do something a bit stupid. The game went on. Henry's advantage was so enormous he had difficulty keeping his winnings down to a reasonable sum. Every now and again he would risk for a third card when he already knew it was going to bust him. And once when he saw that his first card was going to be an ace, he put out his smallest stake, then made a great show of cursing himself aloud for not having made a bigger bet in the first place. In an hour he had won exactly £3,000, and there he stopped. He pocketed his chips and made his way back to the cashier's office to turn them in for real money. He had made £3,000 from blackjack and £3,600 from roulette, £6,600 in all. It could just as easily have been £660,000. As a matter of fact, he told himself, he was now almost certainly able to make money faster than any other man in the entire world. Imagine that. The cashier received Henry's pile of chips and plaques without twitching a muscle. He wore steel spectacles, and the pale eyes behind the spectacles were not interested in Henry. They looked only at the chips on the counter. This man also had arithmetic in his fingers. But he had more than that. He had arithmetic, trigonometry, and calculus, and algebra, and Euclidean geometry in every nerve of his body. He was a human calculating machine with 100,000 electric wires in his brain. It took him 5 seconds to count Henry's 120 chips. "Would you like a check for this, Mr. Sugar?" he asked. The cashier, like the man at the desk downstairs, knew every member by name. "No, thank you," Henry said. "I'll take it in cash." "As you wish," said the voice behind the spectacles, and he turned away and went to a safe at the back of the office that must have contained millions. By Lord's House standards, Henry's win was fairly small potatoes. The Arab oil boys were in London now, and they liked to gamble. So did the shady diplomats from the Far East, and the Japanese businessmen, and the British tax-dodging real estate operators. Staggering sums of money were being won and lost, mostly lost in the large London casinos every day. The cashier returned with Henry's money and dropped the bundle of notes on the counter. Although there was enough there to buy a small house or a large automobile, the chief cashier at Lord's House was not impressed. He might just as well have been passing Henry a pack of chewing gum for all the notice he took of the money he was dishing out. "You wait, my friend," Henry thought to himself as he pocketed the money. "You just wait." He walked away. "Your car, sir," said the man at the door in the green uniform. "Not yet," Henry told him. "I think I'll take a bit of fresh air first." He strolled away down the street. It was nearly midnight. The evening was cool and pleasant. The great city was still wide awake. Henry could feel the bulge in the inside pocket of his jacket where the big wad of money was lying. He touched the bulge with one hand. He patted it gently. It was a lot of money for an hour's work. And what of the future? What was the next move going to be? He could make $1 million in a month. He could make more if he wanted to. There was no limit to what he could make. Walking through the streets of London in the cool of the evening, Henry began to think about the next move. Hold on. Now, if this had been a made-up story instead of a true one, it would have been necessary to invent some sort of surprising and exciting end for it. It would not be difficult to do that. Something dramatic and unusual. So before telling you what really did happen to Henry in real life, let us pause here for a moment to see what a competent fiction writer would have done to wrap up the story. His notes would read something like this. Number 1. Henry must die. Like Imrat Khan before him, he had violated the code of the yogi and had used his powers for personal gain. Number 2. It will be best if he dies in some unusual and interesting manner that will surprise the reader. Number 3. For example, he could go home to his flat and start counting his money and gloating over it. While doing this, he might suddenly begin to feel unwell. He has a pain in his chest. Number 4. He becomes frightened. He decides to go to bed immediately and rest. He takes off his clothes. He walks naked to the closet to get his pajamas. He passes the full-length mirror that stands against the wall. He stops. He stares at the reflection of his naked self in the mirror. Automatically, from force of habit, he begins to concentrate. And then, number 5. All at once, he is seeing through his own skin. He sees through it in the same way that he saw through those playing cards a while back. It is like an X-ray picture, only far better. An X-ray can only see the bones and the very dense areas. Henry can see everything. He sees his arteries and veins with the blood pumping through him. He can see his liver, his kidneys, his intestines, and he can see his heart beating. Number 6. He looks at the place in his chest where the pain is coming from, and he sees, or thinks he sees, a small dark lump inside the big vein leading into the heart on the right-hand side. What could a small dark lump be doing inside the vein? It must be a blockage of some kind. It must be a clot. A blood clot. Number 7. At first the clot seems to be stationary. Then it moves. The movement is very slight, no more than a millimeter or 2. The blood inside the vein is pumping up behind the clot and pushing past it, and the little clot moves again. It jerks forward about half an inch, this time up the vein towards the heart. Henry watches in terror. He knows, as almost everyone else in the world knows, that a blood clot that has broken free and is traveling in a vein will ultimately reach the heart. When it reaches the heart, you often die. That wouldn't be such a bad ending for a work of fiction. But this story is not fiction. It is true. The only untrue things about it are Henry's name and the name of the gambling casino. Henry's name was not Henry Sugar. His name has to be protected. It still must be protected. And for obvious reasons, one cannot call the casino by its real name. Apart from that, it is a true story. And because it is a true story, it must have the true ending. The true one may not be quite so dramatic or spooky, or spooky as a made-up one could be, but it is nonetheless interesting. Here is what actually happened. To be continued.